being recorded, and it will be uploaded to our website soon. So if you'd like to go back and watch it again, you're welcome to do that. And so tonight, let's get to the presentation. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Elliott Bowen. He is a historian of medicine and public health and is an assistant professor in the Department of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. A native of the Chicago area, he received his PhD in 2013 from Binghamton University in New York. His research interests center on the history of sexually transmitted diseases, and his current book, In Search of Sexual Health, Diagnosing and Treating Syphilis in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 1890 to 1940, offers up a history of the city known as the Mecca of the American syphilitic, on account of the thousands of men and women who annually journeyed there in the early 20th century to be treated for venereal infections. In addition to the history of STDs, Elliott's teaching interests include the history of gender and sexuality, medicine and empire, bioethics, and the modern United States. Elliott, thank you for being here. And I believe it's 12 hours ahead. So you woke up early to be here with us. So I am going to unshare my screen, and I'm going to turn off my video and audio and turn it over to you.
Where is it?
Thank you so much, Tim, for that warm introduction. As you mentioned, I am coming to you from a very different time zone where it is just early morning. And thank you for accommodating me on the time too. I know that your meetings usually happen a little bit earlier in the evening than they are today. It's really wonderful to be with all of you and to have the opportunity to talk about syphilis and its relationship with hot springs during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Can you all see the screen? I've got the PowerPoint shared with you here. Okay, I will assume that you can see it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got into this research and then provide a brief overview of the book itself. So you can see some of the research questions that I'm asking and the different answers that I propose to those in the book. Before I get into any of this though, I want to extend some words of thanks. Though I may have been the person who wrote this book would not have been possible without the assistance and the input of lots of people in Arkansas who helped me at various stages of the research to put this thing together. First and foremost, Tim already mentioned her, but I want to give a big thanks to Liz Robbins and all of the volunteers working at the Garland County Historical Society, without whom I would have never come across many of the amazing primary sources that I was able to access to do this research. I also spent a few weeks when I was a graduate student at the Historical Research Center at University of Arkansas Medical Sciences Library, where at the time Amanda Saar was in charge, and she similarly helped me locate a number of medical journals and other primary source materials that eventually ended up in my book. So thanks to everyone at the Historical Research Center. And finally, while I was in Hot Springs, I also received a lot of generous input and assistance from some of the staff at Hot Springs National Park, most notably Tommy Hill. Without the work of individuals like these, the book that I'm presenting on would have never been possible. So again, from the bottom of my heart, thanks to each of those for allowing this thing to come into the world. I'm really, really appreciative of that. So I want to talk a little bit at the start here about how I got into this project, because when I started, I had no idea that Hot Springs was, as Tim mentioned, a kind of mecca for syphilitic patients in the early 20th century US. Hot Springs is not something that is really mentioned in the historical scholarship on sexually transmitted diseases. And I came across this quite accidentally. I guess, as so often happens in the early stage of research, you stumble onto a topic and then you realize you've got something that you could have never imagined possible. For me, this began when I was a graduate student at Binghamton University. I knew that I was interested in the history of medicine and public health, and that I wanted to focus on some aspect of sexually transmitted diseases. When I started my research, I was not thinking about hot springs at all, because I didn't even know that this place existed, not as a health resort, not as a place for people with syphilis to get treatment. I was initially interested in doing research on the Philippines, which at the time I was studying was a US colony. And while doing research on syphilis in the Philippines, I came across some rather interesting references. On one island in the Philippines, there was a military hospital where the doctor in charge said that there existed hot springs that are similar to those found in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And I paused when I read this quote and I asked myself, similar to what? Hot Springs, Arkansas also has a place for treating syphilis patients? I didn't know about that at all. And I got more interested in figuring out what I could, because there hadn't been many studies of this town or of its relationship with syphilis. One of the first reports that I came across was a letter, and I used this to open the book. It was a letter written from a man in Baltimore named G.W. Banks to a friend he addressed as Jeannie. And in this letter, he talks about how two of his friends had recently gone to Hot Springs to receive treatment for venereal disease. And then he says, kind of in jest, I think, all syphilitics go to hot springs. The hot water soaks the mercury into them. Don't give this away. And again, after reading this letter, I thought, really, this is fascinating. I had never heard of this before. No one had ever talked about it. Did all syphilitics go to hot springs? Was this really the therapeutic destination of choice for those suffering from syphilis around this time period? And as I continued my research, I found quite a lot of literature corroborating this opinion. That is, that an awful lot of people around the turn of the century, tens of thousands of people annually, in fact, were going to hot springs for the express purpose of bathing in the health resort's waters to be treated for syphilis. Early on in my research, I encountered lots of statements to that effect. Hot springs' popularity in terms of its role as a place for syphilis treatment really begins after the Civil War. It's in the late 1860s that medical observers start touring the region and publishing accounts of the people that they find there being treated for all different kinds of diseases. And as the Chicago Medical Journal noted in 1866, there are probably more old syphilitic cases than any other form of disease. And this trend continued throughout the late 19th century, by the last decade of which the Memphis Medical Weekly was reporting about how syphilitic subjects flocked to the place from all parts of the United States. As I came across findings like these, I got more and more interested in hot springs and in exploring the different reasons that people went there to be treated for syphilis, the different kinds of experiences they had, if they consulted doctors, if they went to hospitals or clinics. All of this was unknown at the time, but as a graduate student, it really piqued my curiosity. And the more I learned, the more I became engrossed with this topic and all of the different ways that hot springs offer treatment to syphilitic patients. What I discovered early on in the research was that not only was there a local group of medical professionals who dedicated themselves solely to the treatment of syphilis, these were some of the most advanced, most best educated doctors in the treatment of this disease. There was a medical corps that practically consisted of venereal specialists. So there were privately practicing physicians in Hot Springs who focused solely on this disease and derived their income almost solely from the treatment of syphilis. But in addition to these privately practicing physicians and their offices and clinics, there was also a medical infrastructure within Hot Springs that became quite vast over time, and that was also dedicated to treating syphilitic patients. Of course, one example of this is the bathhouses of Hot Springs, of which there were many around the turn of the century. Doctors often sent patients to these bathhouses for the express purpose of syphilitic treatment. In addition to that, I discovered that in the 1880s, the US military established a military hospital in Hot Springs, the Hot Springs Army and Navy General Hospital, which, among other things, took lots of cases of syphilis, many of whom were veterans of the Civil War who had come there in an old, broken down state with the later stages of syphilis, what was called at the time tertiary syphilis. And this hospital continued to treat syphilitic patients through the early part of the 20th century into World War I. After World War I, the city's venereal infrastructure grew even more because in 1920, the federal government established the first free public health facility for venereal disease anywhere in the country. This was the Hot Springs Venereal Clinic. Its first director was Oliver Wenger, who ran the facility from 1921 through 1936. And during the time that the Hot Springs Clinic was in operation, more than 60,000 patients, men and women, Black and white, made their way through this facility to receive treatment for syphilis and or gonorrhea. So it seemed as I got into the research that there was this story emerging that would be about the city's relationship with syphilis and how that evolved over time from the late 1800s through the middle part of the 20th century. And in the book, what I try to do is focus on all of these specific sites. The bathhouses, doctors' offices, the military hospital, the VD clinic run by the federal government, among them, and talk about the experiences of the patients who wound their way through these different institutions. So I began the research with some fairly basic question. I wanted to know who was going to Hot Springs. Was it really the case, as the letter I just mentioned noted, that all syphilitics went to Hot Springs, or was it just some syphilitics who went there? I tried to get a sense of the demographic breakdown of the venereal health seekers of Hot Springs. And secondly, also a very basic question, what reasons did people have for going there? Was it something that they did when all other options had been exhausted? Was it kind of a treatment of last resort? Was it something that people did early on in the disease after they first became infected? What were their reasons for going there? And then thirdly, of course, what kinds of therapeutic outcomes did they meet with? What were their experiences in Hot Springs like? Did they go to any of these medical institutions, or did they just try to cure themselves by bathing in the waters? What happened to them? And were there differences in the way that different kinds of patient groups interacted with the city's medical infrastructure and some of its medical personnel? And here in particular, I was interested in looking at to see if there are any racial disparities in healthcare, or, for example, any differences in the experiences of men versus women. I started out with these really basic questions. I felt like I had to ask them because they had not really been discussed before. There isn't a whole lot of historical scholarship on Hot Springs that focuses specifically on syphilis. So before I went any further, I felt I had to get an answer to these introductory questions. And that's when I began to research this book in earnest. As I mentioned, there is quite an impressive historical literature on sexually transmitted diseases. A lot of the scholarship on this topic, not surprisingly, dates back to the 1980s, when the AIDS crisis was really getting underway in the United States. Historians influenced and informed by that more recent infectious disease started looking back at earlier time periods to see how the United States had grappled with earlier periods of sexually transmitted disease infection through the US. And looking through this scholarship, I found that, again, no one really talks about hot springs. You see it appear from time and time again, but just no more than a sentence or a footnote in most cases. So it felt like I had a real opportunity to contribute to the historical scholarship on sexually transmitted diseases more generally by focusing specifically on this place. And in terms of particular contributions I was hoping to make, a lot of my work has tried to build off of the writings of Alan Brandt, who is a very well-known historian of medicine who works at Harvard University, and in 1985 published what is probably the most influential piece of historical research on syphilis, his book, No Magic Bullet. One of the interesting claims that Brandt makes in this book is that the way that Americans have thought about and responded to sexually transmitted infections have, for a very long time, been influenced by our ideas about morality, sexual morality in particular. As you can see here from the quote on the screen, Brandt argues that because of the moral and religious mindset that Americans have brought to bear on syphilis, our response to this disease has been primarily behavioral and not primarily therapeutic. As you can see, I've highlighted this section in bold where he says, therapeutic approaches to syphilis and gonorrhea have remained secondary. And this is one of the things that I was trying to grapple with in my research, because of course I found all of this evidence that thousands and thousands of people every year were going to hot springs to be treated for syphilis. Of course, Brandt says that the therapeutic response was secondary. And I had to ask, was that really the case? It does seem like an awful lot of people were interested in getting cured of this disease. That's what brought them to hot springs. So perhaps this is a little bit of an overstatement. Perhaps actually there was a pretty robust therapeutic response to syphilis in the early 20th century. It just hadn't been written about because no one knew about hot springs' role in influencing the country's therapeutic responses to syphilis. So this also gave me a sense that there was an opportunity to say something new, to bring something new to the table in terms of all of this wonderful scholarship on sexually transmitted disease. So my interest from the very beginning has been about medical practice, about the therapeutic strategies that people partake in when they become ill. What do people do when they get sick? What kinds of medical professionals or medical advice do they seek? What kinds of outcomes do they meet with in terms of clinics or hospitals? And how do doctors define and diagnose and treat diseases? This is a set of questions that historians have asked a lot about other diseases, but we haven't really talked about them with regard to syphilis. Again, because I think the prevailing sense has been that American responses to this were not curative or therapeutic, but more behavioral. So with these questions, I proceeded to conduct my research. I made numerous trips to Hot Springs and to Little Rock and to other parts in Arkansas and throughout the American South, actually, to obtain some primary source material. And along the way, I was really fortunate to come into the possession of some unique sources, sources that people who write about syphilis generally do not have access to. By luck, I was able to acquire a number of what historians call patient narratives. These are first-hand accounts of individuals who have experienced a particular disease and then written about it, either as diaries or correspondence. One particular patient narrative that I came across was brought to my attention by Liz Robbins at the Garland County Historical Society, where one day I walked in and she informed me that she had recently been given a stack of letters from someone who traveled to Hot Springs in the early 20th century. This was an individual named Archie Cowles, who came to Hot Springs all the way from Cleveland, Ohio, first in 1905 and then in 1907. When Liz handed me these letters, I don't think she knew that the patient in particular had syphilis, but there in the diaries, he does mention the disease. He mentions how he acquires it. He talks about what syphilis did to his body physically and the impact that it had on his mental state as well during the course of 13 months that he spent in Hot Springs trying to get better from this disease. Unfortunately for Archie Cowles, he did not. Like many people who went to Hot Springs, Cowles eventually lost his battle with syphilis and died there. You can see from the quote on the screen that this particular individual was not overly fond of doctors. While traveling to Hot Springs via the railroad system, he at one point talked to a fellow health seeker and said, "If I had my way, I would shoot 90% of the blankety blank doctors at the Springs so people could get the benefit of the baths." So as Cowles' own writings confirm, there were some patients who went to Hot Springs and really set about the business of caring for themselves without consulting any medical professionals or any medical opinion whatsoever. The entire time that he was in Hot Springs, Cowles went to a doctor a grand total of one time, and he did not have a very favorable experience. Another patient narrative that I came across was brought to my attention by Tommy Hill at the Hot Springs National Park. This is another journey to Hot Springs in the first decade of the 20th century. The individual in question here was a man named Michael J. Murphy, who came to Hot Springs in 1906 from Palatka, Florida. His story, much like Archie Cowles, ended on a very sad, tragic note. He also died in Hot Springs. His letters make it clear that when he first arrived in Hot Springs, he did not know that he had syphilis. But unlike Cowles, he consulted a doctor, and that doctor diagnosed him with treatment and then put him on the standard Mercury cure for the disease, in addition to prescribing regular trips to a bathhouse. But eventually the strain of the disease became so overwhelming for Michael Murphy that this man decided to end his life by suicide. The excerpt from his letters you see on the screen here is the last thing he ever wrote. It is his suicide note, in which he talks about the reasons that he feels that he cannot go on living. In the course of my research, another way that I was able to get at individual experiences of syphilis was through the National Archives, particularly with respect to the Hot Springs Venereal Disease Clinic that was set up in 1921. The archives in Maryland, in College Park, contain files of a number of different individuals who wrote to the director of the clinic, Oliver Wenger, about their desires to recover from syphilis. I've just pulled out one letter from among the many that are within this archive. This comes from a patient who at the time lived in Clovis, New Mexico, His name was Virgil Orrin Adams, and in the worst days of the Great Depression, 1934 specifically, he wrote to Oliver Wenger, the head of the Hot Springs Clinic, to talk about his desire to come travel there so that he could recover from a syphilitic infection that had made his life miserable over the course of the last few years. It's documents like these that really helped me approach this disease and its history from a kind of bottom-up perspective. As a medical historian, I am really, really interested in doing what is called history from the bottom up, which entails looking at patient narratives like those I've shared with you, and then trying to piece together a narrative of illness that takes the patient's view of things into account and looks at it from their perspective to try to see what does the disease mean to them, how do they grapple with it, how does it impact their lives. And fortunately, encountering sources like that, I was able to do this. Another really big coup for me in terms of the sources is that I was able to come across lots of clinical case files, particularly the records of the Army and Navy General Hospital, which, as I noted before, was established in 1884, contain thousands and thousands of individualized medical records of soldiers and veterans who were treated at this hospital, many of them for syphilis. These records are located in the Southwest branch of the National Archives, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. And I spent many, many weeks there going through these individual files to try to identify soldiers and veterans who went to Hot Springs to be treated for syphilis and then found their way into this military hospital. And in the book, I have a whole chapter that talks about the way that doctors diagnosed and treated syphilis on the basis of these records. So having talked a little bit about my main research question and some of the sources that I've used to try to get at these questions, I want to next spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key claims that I make in the book. And perhaps having listened so far to everything I've said about patients and their importance in the history of medicine, you will not be surprised to see that my arguments in part have to do with patients. One of the big arguments that I'm making in the book is that Hot Springs' response to syphilis, and more generally, the United States' response to syphilis, was not just influenced by medical authorities and their institutions, but was also influenced by everyday people, namely health seekers and venereal disease patients. Along with that, another thing that I found that was quite interesting in the course of my research is that residents of Hot Springs also had an impact on the way that medicine and public health dealt with this particular disease from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So in talking about these two arguments, I want to focus on one particular chapter of the book. Comes near the end of the book, and it deals with the Hot Springs VD Clinic, which, as I noted, was established in the aftermath of World War I, first opened in 1921, and through 1936, its director was an individual named Oliver C. Wenger. He was probably one of the leading venereologists of his day. He is perhaps best known for his later work with the Tuskegee syphilis study, but before that began, he was the director of the clinic and oversaw its day-to-day operations for more than 15 years, during which time more than 60,000 patients received treatment for syphilis and gonorrhea at the clinic. You can see on the screen here, I've broken down the patient admissions by demographics in terms of race and sex. The vast majority of those who received treatment at Wenger's clinic were white men. But you can see over time, there is also quite a notable increase in the number of white women who received treatment there as well. When Oliver Wenger came to Hot Springs in 1920, he did so with a very conventional mindset about how to grapple with venereal disease. Wenger had been trained in the military, and in his time working with the Public Health Service, he came to believe that, as the traditional wisdom at the time dictated, the best way to stamp out syphilis and gonorrhea was to declare war on prostitution. Hot Springs at the time, and the aftermath of World War I, as it had been for decades, was a fairly wide open city in the sense that brothels and commercial sex existed without much impediment from legal authorities. And when Wenger came to Hot Springs in 1920, he wanted to change all of that. He actually issued an edict to the city before his arrival, stating that unless Hot Springs cleaned up its act with regard to commercial sex, then the clinic and all the funding that would come for it might not exist. When he first arrived in 1920, he published a series of papers that were designed to study the phenomenon of prostitution within Hot Springs. He actually employed a number of social service workers to gather observational data and to do in-depth investigations into sex work in Hot Springs. The results did not surprise him on the basis of what he had seen before. And within the community of Hot Springs, he labeled women uncontrolled spreaders of infection. He said that they were a menace to the community at large. In lectures that he gave to patients, male patients that is, at the VD clinic, he advised them to keep away from women. This is a very typical way of thinking about venereal disease in early 20th century America. Most physicians and public health workers believed that the root source of syphilis and gonorrhea was women, namely female prostitutes. And so for Wenger, early on in his crusade against VD, prostitutes were the focal point of his work. He actively labored to shut down the city's brothels and to arrest and imprison those who worked in the commercial sex industry. Interestingly, however, it does not appear that his campaign was terribly successful. Having undertaken this throughout the 1920s, one might expect that the past commercial sex sector would have been shut down. But in fact, this was not the case at all. In fact, visitors who traveled through Hot Springs during the Great Depression noted that prostitution was alive and well within the city, Wenger's efforts notwithstanding. One particular visitor in 1934 wrote that Hot Springs was the only national park where gambling, imbibing, and prostitution go unmolested. So Wenger, it appears, failed to curtail the city's long history of commercial sex work. And I argue that one of the reasons for this is, of course, the resistance of the commercial sex industry itself, but also that Wenger's views on prostitution and its relationship with venereal disease changed over time. Over the course of his many years in Hot Springs, Wenger encountered a number of female patients who could only support themselves financially while within Hot Springs by turning to prostitution. He wrote of women who were, quote, forced by dire necessity to support themselves by prostitution. And this was the beginning of a rather big shift in the way that he thought about prostitution. When he entered Hot Springs in 1920, Wenger believed that people became prostitutes because they were immoral, that there was something debased in their own moral code. But gradually, he came to see prostitution not as a moral act, but in terms of socioeconomic circumstances. He realized that the material basis of these women's lives was so poor that they had no other option but to turn to prostitution. And because of this, he began to look at these women through a much more sympathetic lens. Interviewing one patient who was forced to turn to prostitution, he wrote at one point to his superiors in Washington that it is hard to be chaste and hungry. Interestingly, this kind of emerging socioeconomic explanation of syphilis also colored the way that Wenger wrote about other kinds of patient groups within hot springs, not just prostitutes, but, for example, military veterans who came to hot springs, people from all parts of the country. When writing about them, Wenger referred to these patients as unfortunate people. And he noted how poverty intersected with their infections in a way that made it very difficult to obtain the needed healthcare resources. With the passage of time, this economic understanding of syphilis also influenced the way that Wenger understood the intersections between race and venereal disease. Many early 20th century American doctors were convinced that African Americans were completely lacking in sexual morality, and they used that assumption to undergird their explanations for why Black men and women had higher rates of syphilis than white men and women. But Wenger, interestingly, over time came to reject this moral argument, which was rooted in racism and white supremacy. Instead, what he came to realize is that when you take into account the social and economic backgrounds of Black and white patients, you realize that there's actually little difference in their infection rates. So Wenger comes to see that the difference between Black and white infection rates is only a function of poverty and access to material resources. So with this shift in Wenger's thinking about venereal disease, the Hot Springs VD clinic itself became a very different institution than the one that Wenger started out with. At the beginning of his time in Hot Springs, Wenger had hoped to make the city a center of venereological research, a place where new state-of-the-art treatments could be devised for syphilis and gonorrhea. And as part of that effort, Springs conducted a lot of medical experiments with patients, many of these involving brand new diagnostic and therapeutic technologies that had not been widely tested, but that offered some promise in the cure of syphilis. But one of the problems that Wenger ran into is that a lot of his patients simply could not afford to remain in Hot Springs long enough for these studies to be completed. In fact, in the late 1920s, right before the Great Depression, a federal official in Washington looking at the results of Wenger's research concluded that the clinic, in fact, would not be useful from a research standpoint because the patients were too transient. They could not remain in Hot Springs long enough for this research to go on. And this also was one of the things that triggered a shift in the clinic's response to venereal disease. It started about research, but it ended up being about trying to secure the material well-being of the city's patients so that they could, in fact, remain in the city long enough to be cured. In the early 1930s, as the Great Depression got underway, Wenger, looking for ways to deal with the extra medical concerns that syphilis involves, was able to secure money from the federal government to provide venereal health seekers with free room and board in the city's hotels. And this had a notable impact on the success of their journeys to hot springs. If you look at the graph on the screen here, you can see that from 1932 forward, the number of injections of salvarsan, which was a standard treatment for syphilis at the time, increases quite notably. And that is because patients were able to actually stay in hot springs long enough to secure the required period of treatment. And they were able to do that because the federal government started providing money directly to hotels so that patients did not have to do things like work while they were in hot springs receiving treatment. In addition to this, in 1934 and 1935, Wenger started putting together plans for a transient facility, a special camp that would be located on the outskirts of hot springs to provide additional care to those individuals who came to hot springs for treatment. This plan was something that was actively resisted by local residents of hot springs. In one famous newspaper editorial, a local judge said that if the federal government continues to invite these patients, who are referred to as the scum of the earth, I guess we'll have to move out and just give the town to you. So there was a lot of anger over the federal government's intervention into hot springs to secure the medical well-being of the venereal disease patients being treated there. Nonetheless, in 1935, Wenger got his wishes and Day was constructed on the outskirts of the city. Interestingly, the camp existed for one group and one group only of VD patients. It was designed to house and provide for the domiciliary needs of men. There were no women, no racial minorities allowed in this camp. It existed exclusively for white men who received a much better standard of care overall than any other group within hot springs. This is some of the ways that we can see racism undergirding the federal government's response to syphilis at this time. But the camp did not exist for long. It was a very short-lived experiment. Owing to opposition, again, from local interests, in 1937, it was actually closed. There was a lot of concern among local residents that devoting so much of the city's livelihood to syphilis would be bad business, as the director of the Hot Springs Reservation noted in a letter to Wenger from 1935. And eventually, this resistance to the federal government's incursion into hot springs is what helped bring about the decline of the city as a health resort for syphilitics. In 1939, at which point Oliver Wenger had left Hot Springs, the director of the United States Public Health Service Venereal Disease Division, Raymond Vonderlehr, wrote in a testimony to Congress that I do not think that the people there want hot springs and the baths to become popular as a place where venereal diseases are treated. These kinds of sentiments, along with the appearance of penicillin and other antibiotics in the 1940s, led to the end of hot springs history as the quote-unquote mecca for syphilitics. And that is when my story ends as well. So at this point, I'm going to pause and see if anyone has questions or comments they would like to make about anything I've said today or about the book more generally. Thank you all for your attention and for being here. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you about this topic.
Thank you, Elliott. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. We do have some time for some questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to type it into the chat box, or you can also do the, if you want to do a thumbs up on the emoticon, you can do that. And then we can, I can unmute you and you can just ask your question that way. There's always a little bit of a delay when
I'm
people
on
start
mute.
typing questions, though. We have a question from someone about, out of curiosity, how did you end up in Kazakhstan?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a really fascinating story. So I have been living and working in Kazakhstan since 2016. That was a few years after I finished my dissertation and got my PhD. One of the reasons that I have moved here is because in the United States, history of medicine is not a subject that is given, I think, enough importance by American colleges and universities. And so as a result of that, there are actually very few job openings in this specific subfield within history. So when I was looking around for jobs, I had to focus not just in the US, but also look abroad. And it so happened that I came across a university that was looking for a historian of medicine and public health. 2016, I applied for that job and lots of other ones, but this is the one that I got, and I have been here ever since.
Anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, but I don't know how to type.
We do have a question. So were any of the treatments successful? If not, why did people keep coming to hot springs?
That's a really great question. And it's a hard one to answer because we don't have sufficient data in order to see if people were actually being cured of the disease. If you read the medical literature from the time period, it seems like the treatments that doctors were offering in hot springs did at least provide alleviation of symptoms. So some of the physical manifestations of syphilis were positively effective, in a sense, cleared away by the combination of mercury, salvarsan, and of course, the baths. But I don't think any of those treatments really reached to the root cause of the disease. They did not act on the bacteria that is responsible for transmitting the disease. That really didn't happen until penicillin arrived in the 1940s. That's the first time you get a truly effective drug for taking care of syphilis. I will say, in addition to that, there is a whole other side of the disease that I became aware of during my research, because syphilis is not something that just impacts the body. It's also something that impacts the mind and the heart and the there's a psychological dimension to this disease that was particularly acute in the early 20th century because of the way that syphilis was associated with immorality. This caused patients to experience all kinds of shame and guilt and anxiety over their conditions. But hot springs was one place where patients did not have to experience those things, because when they traveled to hot springs, they were among strangers who had a very similar unfortunate condition. And patients were able to commiserate with each other. They often formed close bonds of friendship and cared for each other in terms of their day-to-day medical needs. And that provided a lot of relief for the psychological and emotional toll that this disease took. It's not something that was a result of their medical treatment, really. It's just something that patients were able to do for themselves within the relatively destigmatized environment that was hot springs. And I think that's a huge part of the reason that this place was so popular.
We have another question. How did advertising promote hot springs as a place for treatment beyond referrals from medical professionals? Did patients come from around the US or internationally as well?
Patients did come from all parts of the US. Not surprisingly, it was Arkansas itself and neighboring states that provided the bulk of the medical tourism to hot springs. But you also find in the records cases coming from New York, from California, from Canada, and yes, even from Great Britain and other places abroad as well. In terms of the question of promotion, this is really, really fascinating. One of the things that I found in my research is that local doctors within Hot Springs were quite attuned to the national dialogue about syphilis that was happening. Right? They knew that there was this discourse of immorality that covered people's understanding of the disease, and they used that for their own promotional purposes to great success by doing things like advertising Hot Springs as a place where people could experience things like forgiveness. Hot Springs was talked about as a place that had been created by God Almighty for the relief of spiritual sins. And this kind of religious, spiritual understanding of the place that was promoted through advertising is, I think, part of what attracted so many syphilitic patients to Hot Springs, right? If you have a disease that is said to be the result of God's punishment for your immoral conduct, you're much more likely to go to a place that is said to offer a kind of divine cure for your disease. So religion was actually one of the things that was used to trumpet Hot Springs' success in the treatment of syphilis, and that is also part of the reason that it became such a popular health resort for this disease.
We have another question. Did you find any accounts by female patients?
That's a wonderful question. In terms of the patient narrative that I discussed before, which are, lengthy primary sources where individuals on a week-by-week basis almost are writing letters to loved ones or journaling their experiences in Hot Springs, we don't have anything like that I have seen from female patients. What you do find in the archives here and there are references to female health seekers, but these are filtered or mediated accounts. So, for example, Oliver Wenger or another medical professional talking at length about a woman's experience coming to Hot Springs and being treated for syphilis. And stories of female patients are scattered throughout the book in chapter after chapter. I've done as best a job as I could have, I think, to incorporate the voices of women patients. It's unfortunate that we don't have the same kinds of source material for them that we do for people like Archie Cowles or Michael Murphy. The research on this is there's more that could be done. So hopefully, in continuing the search for primary sources, we can actually uncover some of those accounts. I do know more generally, if you're not talking about syphilis, but you're looking just at general experiences, there is some primary source collections that tell us about women's experiences in Hot Springs.
We have another question. During distressed economic times, were patients offered economic incentives to participate in treatment trials?
As far as I know, they were not. If you read the reports that Wenger and the doctors at the clinic wrote, they often end by saying, well, this drug or this technology looks promising, but the results are not conclusive because out of a couple dozen patients, 20 of them left after 2 weeks, and so we don't really know what the long-term effects of it are. The studies often end on that sad note, which leads me to believe that they were not providing any kinds of en masse economic assistance to research subjects.
We had a comment from Michael Dugan, who's a historian up in Northeast Arkansas. One story I heard from Michael was that sex education in Hot Springs consisted of tours of the facility and seeing some interesting pictures.
Yes, I have heard that as well. It does appear that hot springs was also used to promote abstinence as a form of sex education through the mid part of the 20th century. I remember having a discussion at one point with an individual who was a volunteer at the Garland County Historical Society, who mentioned that in his youth as a student, he and his classmates would be taken to a wax museum within Hot Springs that contained small figurines of people displaying the physical effect of syphilis on the body. And the comment that I got from this person was that that was an attempt basically to instill fear in students, to make them afraid of sex by showing them what the results of this could be. So it did serve as a sort of sexual education. Also, in addition to that, if you look at some of the medical guidebooks that were published in Hot Springs from the 1870s forward, you'll often come across lines that say things like, if the youth of America need instruction in how to behave in a sexually moral way, they should come to Hot Springs and witness the freaks and monstrosities and the horrors of this disease firsthand. So I would say, yes, sex education was also something that was available in Hot Springs and could be used toward the end of promoting abstinence.
We have a question about, and I'll probably butcher the way these are pronounced. Salverstein.
Yes, was, yeah, you're right. It's in the so both Salvarsan and Mercury are toxic chemical products. Mercury had been in use since the 1600s. It was a very long-lived treatment for syphilis. And doctors in Hot Springs started using it early part of the 20th century. The doctors of Hot Springs, if you're interested, developed a rather innovative method of administering mercury to patients. They had this technique that they called mercury by inunction, in which bathhouse attendants would be employed to actually rub mercurial ointment into the backs of patients, ounces upon ounces at a time. And that mercury by inunction treatment was the preferred way of doing it at Hot Springs. Combined with bath that would hopefully flush out some of the toxins, because when you're bathing in these near boiling waters, you sweat a lot. And with that process, some of the toxicity of the mercury is dissipated over time. But yeah, mercury was used through the 19-teens and the 1920s. Salvarsan, a much better, by most accounts, a much better treatment for syphilis, was first invented in 1910 by a team of German and Japanese researchers. It came into use pretty early in Hot Springs. Some of the first indications we have of its use are from 1911 and 1912. Interestingly, a lot of physicians in Hot Springs did not like Salvarsan. In part, they were opposed to it because some of the early studies showed that it could have quite dramatic bad effects on patients if used badly, but also some of their resistance to Salvarsan was professional, because local healers realized that as Salvarsan, this more effective drug, became more and more popular throughout the country, that would mean fewer patients coming to Hot Springs. So in the 1920s, resident physicians organized this campaign to try to preserve the city's special relationship with syphilis by crafting an entirely new form of syphilitic treatment that didn't involve any drugs at all. No mercury, no Salvarsan. It was a purely hydrotherapeutic, water-only cure of syphilis. And it was used to try to stage off, or to fend off, I would say, the perceived decline in the number of patients coming to hot springs. And Salvarsan was used by the federal government at the Venereal Disease Clinic when it was set up in 1921. They used Salvarsan all the way through the 1930s until penicillin came around in 1941.
Did the people coming to hot springs, was it more doctors recommending them come to hot springs, or was it more word of mouth in the public that drove people to hot springs?
It was both, I would say. Part of what made hot springs such a successful health resort is that local physicians established a lot of connections with expert venereologists all throughout the country. The resident healers of hot springs often attended conferences and other professional gatherings throughout the country. They presented papers at conferences, they wrote in nationally renowned journals, and through that they were able to kind of build up a professional network that linked them to some of the leading venereologists of their day. And through those connections, they received a lot of references because doctors in New York or Chicago, for example, would say, on the basis of my personal knowledge and relationship with this physician in Hot Springs, I'm telling my patient that they should go there for treatment. So part of it was due to the business acumen, let's say, of the healers of hot springs. But part of it was also word of mouth. And some of this happened beginning in the aftermath of the Civil War, where a lot of medical observers, doctors from different parts of the country, traveled to hot springs, often by themselves, to observe what was there, and then they returned home to publish accounts. And they often noted how among the various diseases treated in hot springs, there was none more prominent or more notable than syphilis. And this also helped kind of spread the word about its apparent therapeutic success in the cure of this disease.
You mentioned the prostitution and the effort and the campaign to clean up prostitution. Is it people coming from out of state or out of the country, even to hot springs? Did local people, if they had contracted syphilis in hot springs, were local people coming to the clinics as well, or was it mainly just people from out of state?
It was both. I mean, I think one of the things that Wenger, as a public health official, was concerned with was interstate sexual commerce. The problem of having people in the process of coming from far away to hot springs, engaging in prostitution in city after city, and spreading numerous unknown infections to the people that they were having sex with before even arriving at hot springs, right? So what he came to realize is that he could not just focus on hot springs itself. In order to really solve this problem, he argued, America needed to fundamentally change its underlying social and economic structure. And this is not a surprising thing for him to say. In the Great Depression, of course, when there was a nationwide economic catastrophe, you have lots of doctors beginning to realize that the medical problems that we face as a country actually have a material basis, and that if we could tackle poverty, then we can probably tackle some of these diseases more successfully too. But that fear of the way that travel could be connected to the transmission of disease was one of his foremost concerns. But we also know that there were people within hot springs also traveling to the clinic, and this included local prostitutes. Interestingly, the local medical profession had a somewhat sympathetic approach to prostitution. Local doctors did not have any moral qualms about treating sex workers for syphilis or gonorrhea. In fact, the mayor of Hot Springs in the 19-teens was a doctor by the name of McClendon, and he was also a proponent of the kind of wide open town with medical services provided to prostitutes. So we know that some of these were also going to the clinic for treatment. And over time, as I said, Wenger became increasingly sympathetic to their plight.
We have a couple of comments. One, Charlotte Ramey was Dr. Wenger's most trusted assistant, and Garrett, who is watching, says that they now live in the house that she grew up in Hot Springs.
That's fascinating. I did not know that at all.
And then we have someone who recommends or says maybe this sounds like material for a screenplay, so maybe there's potential there about you writing a screenplay next about this.
That would be, yeah, that's I had never thought of that, but like I have been toying in my mind with this idea of doing maybe some kind of historical fiction, you know, based on the city and its relationship with syphilis. So thank you for that suggestion.
We have one more question. Does your Hot Springs-based project dovetail with current or future research ideas?
Well, it does in the sense that I'm not done with Hot Springs yet. Even though I have published this book, it's not the end of my involvement with the city, because there's a lot more to be said, even just with regard to syphilis. So one of the things that I have started to explore more recently is the relationship between syphilis and homosexuality in Hot Springs. There's one doctor who worked in Hot Springs in the 1920s who spent a lot of time trying to establish what he called a mental hygiene clinic, because he noticed that a lot of the patients coming to Hot Springs to be treated for syphilis were gay. And he thought that these people needed psychological treatment to cure their homosexuality. And he lobbied for federal funds to establish this mental hygiene clinic. He was ultimately unsuccessful, but he did get quite a sympathetic hearing from the federal government. And this has kind of prompted the question for me, because, you know, for the most part in the book, I'm not talking specifically about sexuality and the way that that impacts doctors' understandings of this disease, but it is something that I think is ripe for future research.
And we have one final question. Mary says there's an advantage of anonymity in traveling elsewhere for treatment of a social disease. Was this also a draw from what she understands was a gangster element in Hot Springs?
I think definitely it was. And you're right that within Hot Springs, you could be relatively anonymous because no one knew where you came from, what your past was, all of the connections that you had to friends and family in your local town would be unknown, both residents and other health seekers. And I do think that that was probably, yes, also a draw for, as you say, the quote unquote gangster element in Hot Springs. Being a place where you could escape the long arm of the law, let's say, made it an attractive place to go. And of course, as many of you know, organized crime, the mob, played an outsized role in Hot Springs history, especially during the era of Prohibition. So that's part of it as well.
Well, Elliott, thank you very much. We really appreciate you signing on tonight and getting up early to join us. And we appreciate all that you're doing and preserving the history of health and health sciences in Arkansas and the history of Hot Springs.
Well, again, thank you so much, Tim, for putting this talk together. I know it's a little bit later than you usually meet, so I appreciate you accommodating my time difference here. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to get in touch by email. I'm happy to continue talking about this more because it's a really great subject, and I appreciate you all being here to hear me talk a little bit about the book.
And I will someone asked about the link to purchase the book. When you registered, I received your email for that. So I will send everyone who registered for the event the link to purchase the book and to get that discount. And then I can also forward any questions to you, Elliott, or I can forward your email to the folks as well, so they can just communicate with you directly.
That sounds wonderful. Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elliott. Thank you all for joining in. Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Take care.